Welcome to First Baptist Church in Sweetwater, Texas. We join in with our pastor, Jerry Hendrix, for this week's message.
Ultimately, every disciple understands the meaning of go. Over the last few weeks, we've talked about discipleship and how God transforms us and prepares us to be His disciples. We've talked about different parts of that and what it looks like for us as we continue to grow our relationship and we grow deeper in understanding that for ourselves. And this morning we come to one of those texts that Jesus shares words with His disciples. It's all centered around the word go. That's an important word for us. And this morning as we gather together on the cusp of a lot of going, travel, possibly. We want to think about what it means for us as a disciple to go. What is it that God has for us that's going to require going in our life? Maybe we've already responded to one of those messages in our life. I think what we'll find is that those messages are not just one-time messages. It's a message that's repeated over and over throughout our walk with God. We'll look into the lives of others and look into Scripture and see how it is that God defines that for us this morning. Let's be open to what God has to say to us. In Matthew 28, Jesus shares with His disciples, and we have titled this section, The Great Commission. It's that time when Jesus met with His disciples and having been with them for some time, experienced life with them, He sits them down and He shares with them some deep parts of what discipling really means. He says this starting in verse 16. It says, "Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. And when they saw Him, they worshipped Him, but some doubted. And then Jesus came to them and He said, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you, and surely I'm with you to the very end of the age.'" Time has moved on. There are no longer these disciples in that era, that part of their life where Jesus said, "Come." Now we're at that place where He says, "Go." You see, ultimately, as disciples of Jesus, we discover that for ourselves. That following is something that we do and ultimately leads to going. John Henry Newman. It's probably not a name that you would recognize. He lived during the 19th century. He taught at Oxford, England. He was well respected. He was one of the rising stars of professors and theologians during that era. And that, in case you were curious and did not know already, that was sort of a hotbed for theology in that generation. John Henry Newman was one of those who, as he was rising to the top and writing papers and people were listening to him and his classes were filling up, people began to recognize the name. He was well known. The professors, the other professors that were a part of the theological teaching and training at that particular time, they knew him well and they believed him to be at that particular time one of the sharpest minds in England. At the height of his career, on the brink of becoming one of the greats in terms of theology and the center of where theology happened, he left. And when asked, he responded this way: "Because the souls in Birmingham matter to God." He wasn't talking about Alabama. Birmingham, England. Probably looked a lot like one of our American cities during the industrial age. It was a city that was a steel city. It was a blue-collar town. High crime, poor culture, everything that he enjoyed as a part of being in a theological training, it was absent of. There wasn't a God culture there. There wasn't a prestigious culture. It wasn't a place where people sat around and they talked about deep things and shared deep thoughts. It was a town that worked hard and just got by, and because of that, there was left in that city, in that community, in that era, a lot of orphans. So he gathered together some of his friends. He joined the ministry. He went through the protocol of becoming a part of the ministry and gathered these other ministers together, and they started an orphanage in Birmingham, England. Because the souls of Birmingham matter to God. You know, when Jesus sat with his disciples, it wasn't that he had not already taught them that souls would matter. I think that he had demonstrated it for them. He demonstrated it for them in their presence. He talked about that. He led them. They walked with him. And in their experience together, if they had missed everything else, surely they understood that lives mattered. And Jesus was going to remind them that the souls of the world would matter in all of the nations where his word would be spread. And he asked them if they would go and preach to those nations. Now that was a message that had not yet become clear in their mind. They would not yet understand the totality of what he was trying to share with them. They soon would. We read that in the early chapters of Acts. But he set them down and he taught them that the souls of the world mattered and that they would be those who would deliver his goodness, his love, his message, and his way for them to know God. I first met John Bernard at youth camp. John wasn't a student, though he acted like one. He showed up at youth camp as a sponsor and a Texas Tech student with his skateboard. John was from Houston, Texas. Grew up near Hobby Airport, there on the south part of Houston, inside just outside the second loop, inside the third loop. I think there's 3 there now, something like that. John was one of those kids that showed up at his church, Park Place Baptist Church. He showed up not to go to church or attend youth meetings. He liked their sidewalks and their rails. The youth minister there is a friend of mine. He didn't run him off. Instead, he started spending time with him, and John became a Christian. Went to Texas Tech University to study English. Became a student minister, and he came to camp, and by showing off, he was still young enough that he did a 3-person jump. That's about all the courageous people we could get to lie down on the sidewalk for him to jump over. Didn't have a lot of props at camp. I took the lead. I figure if he missed the other 2, I would be okay. John grew up and he started doing student ministry. He's married now and has a couple of children. And on last week or so, I met with him and he picked me up in his 1964 Ford Econoline van, which he shared with me that was Ford's response to the VW Airbus. Take you back in time for a moment. It was a project for him. It was the second project that he had been involved in. And he was involved in these projects because he left student ministry. There's always a natural curiosity for me when someone leaves a church and ministry for something that's kind of out there on the edge. I wanted to hear his story. He left the comfort of being involved in a ministry that was going well, in a town that was responding well. And it was about, he's still a young guy to me, but he'd been involved in about 3 different student ministries. He left the comfort of all of that to take his family and move to Waco, Texas, to begin a new kind of ministry. They found a house with about 1.5 acres on one of the poorer parts of Waco. And they've established a home there. A home that is open to their neighborhood. A home that once they begin to be established and people begin to recognize him, it will be the home that people can come to be cared for, to be loved, so that they can share their life with them. I'm always intrigued when someone leaves the comfort of a consistent paycheck to take a risk into something that is deeper and more meaningful. John took that step. In fact, John's going to be with us in January. He's going to come up and meet with our staff and walk with us through our church and our community and help us to devise a better strategy for meeting children and meeting needs in Sweetwater, Texas. He'll be here on Wednesday for Kid X so we can see all of our procedure, from driving our buses to having kids on the third floor to meeting with our staff. We're excited about John coming and letting God pour through him into us. Ultimately, it came down to this one question for John. Will you go? You see, I live in John's world. I understand what it's like to be filled, your mind to be filled with ideas. And occasionally opportunity meets idea. But ultimately, when opportunity meets idea, there's that message and that question of, will you go? Will you really do this? And John did. The disciples of Jesus came to that place as well. Now, their comfort was a little different than what you would imagine in our world. I don't think there was the weekly distribution of checks, but they followed Jesus. That come follow me had taken on meaning for them. And as they followed Jesus, Jesus in his context and in his ministry, he was able to provide well for them, and they moved from place to place. As he sits down with them, the question is, will you go? Now, I know that they responded correctly to the question of come and follow me. And I know that at once, in that moment, they left something. Many of them left jobs, they left homes. We don't know because we can only imagine what their life might have been like before they responded to that question early on in their life, early on in the ministry of Jesus. But then there's a transition that occurs here. And what Jesus is helping them to understand is that there's no longer going to be following. Are you challenged by directions? I really like Siri. Can you imagine a time where we had to use maps to get around? Or maybe landmarks. You know, there's a generation before us right now that they'll never know what we're talking about when we talk about directions by landmarks. I can remember being with my dad driving in Fort Worth, and we were trying to get to a family gathering, and we passed the same service station 3 times. An argument broke out. A question broke out. Are you going to stop and ask directions? The answer was no. And we finally arrived at our destination. I can remember when James first started playing basketball, and I was traveling all across the place trying to get to his basketball games, and now we had this sophisticated device called MapQuest. So you could go online, you could find the school, maybe. Google didn't know where all of us were then. You could find it, and you could print out that MapQuest direction, and maybe you could find the high school gym that he was going to be playing in. Made our way around. Life's so much simpler now. We determined a destination on where we were going to eat. I plugged it into Siri, and I'm there. I show up. You know, one of the problems with that, though, if you've been the rider, the co-pilot for someone when they're getting somewhere, and then they drop off the car, and then you have to drive back, and you really don't remember the directions, you get kind of lost. Sometimes in our discipleship, we get so caught up in our following that we forget maybe how it might feel to be on our own. The commission for the disciples to go was not the first time they had heard a commission. It wasn't the first time that Jesus would send them out. In fact, last week we read about how he sent the disciples out, and he told them not to prepare anything. You just go and you share who I am and see how people respond. And if that doesn't work, then move on to the next place. They were accustomed to the question, will you go? But this time, they would go on their own. They would go without following. You see, there comes a time in the life of a disciple where this go part of our life means that we actually have matured our faith to that place where we no longer follow, but we go. Maybe we keep waiting, thinking that we're going to get some new inspiration, and we keep waiting and thinking one day we'll be ready and one day we'll prepare, and we keep gathering and gathering and gathering, and God keeps saying, go, go, go. Now's the time to go. For over 30 years, I'd invested my life in the life of the church as a staff member. I love the church. I love being a part of the church process and the things that we are able to do through the life of the church. I loved every part that I did and every role that I played throughout my career, but I came to a place where the entrepreneurial path for me had kind of taken a new direction, and we were getting ready to start some new things, and I knew that to do that, I was going to have to step outside of my comfort zone and into something that was new, and so I returned to a pew. I didn't yet know what it was that God was going to do. I didn't know what God's next go for me was going to look like. And then my dear friend, a friend, T. Hamilton calls and asked if I'd come preach Advent for you, and that was some years ago now. And I said yes. And through that experience, God drew my heart to you. God drew my heart to this church. God drew my heart to this community. And while I thought that the path for me was going to be this courageous path of being in business and supportive of the church and a staff that I had for so long in my life been a part of, now I was in a pew and I knew that there was something next for me to do. I had no idea that it would be to step into a role as pastor of a First Baptist church. I wasn't First Baptist material. I shared with my family at one point when Teak was here, and I was still pastoring at Cross Point. I think I've shared with you this once. I don't know if I've shared this with the entire group, but I know I've shared it with our Wednesday night group. Oftentimes, when you have, my mind's always working about something else to do and something else that's going on, and for whatever reason, Sharon has gotten accustomed to that. Now, it's still a struggle for us, but she knows that that's going to happen, so I spout off about, hey, what about this? Or what if we did this? So one day on a Sunday lunch, we're all around the table. We still do that a lot at our house. I said, hey, I was real excited. I wanted to sell it well. Because it's like, hey, I've got an idea. I said, hey, what do y'all think about me going to First Baptist Sweetwater? Everyone laughed. Sarah, do you remember that day? Yeah. That was some time before I ever came over here. Trading spaces. That's what I call that. I don't know that it was a great risk, but it was a different risk. And I know that God said, go. And I said, I'm ready. How do we get from here to there? How do we, like the disciples, get from following Jesus to going where Jesus would go? You see, there's a gap there. A gap that my hunch is that most of us, as we think about the story of Jesus and we reflect on the Great Commission, whether we're like John Henry Newman or John Bernard or me, we're dealing with that gap. Within that gap, we will meet God. God will make it clear, and God will provide. Throughout this series and throughout Scripture, you'll see it over and over and over again. How do you get from here to there? Let me share a few things right quick. Follow and then lead. Here's an observation. That disciples really are pretty good, some would argue, but disciples are pretty good at following. The hesitation comes when they no longer follow, but they step into a role and they lead. If you would join us on a Wednesday night, and I would encourage you to do that, there's 3 prayers that I'm encouraging our people to pray. And there's 3 prayers probably I will share with you at some time on a Sunday morning. And one of those has to do with disciples who are called by God, have followed God, but they've not yet said, I'll lead. They're still living in that gap of come follow me and go into all the world. Disciples from here to there, when you agree to go and you agree to go from here to there, you forfeit the opportunity to settle. You forfeit the opportunity to settle. And being settled as a person means a lot of different things to a lot of us. And being settled in a place or in a church or a location, we're not saying that all of that is bad, all that's negative. That's very nurturing, that's very positive. Hopefully you're in a place where you've settled that will help you to grow in your faith. But going from here to there sometimes puts us in that place where we're a little bit unsettled. It's uncharted territory. We're doing something a little bit different outside of our either comfort zone or our skill set or experience. In getting from here to there, we respond to matters that are greater than us. Did you hear that? We respond when we go from here to there. When we respond to the go, we respond to matters that God has identified that are greater than us. The disciples, when you read on, they begin to assemble themselves. They begin to make decisions. They begin to do the things that God had envisioned for them to do. They were able to go from here to there, and because they did, we have church. In your testimony and in your life, because you said yes to God's go, what will future generations say you provided for them? Let's respond to God this morning. We want to have a time of response where we have an opportunity to sing or to worship, however we feel comfortable, to let God speak to us. How do you get from here to there? How do you take those next steps as a disciple? Let me pray.
Thank you for joining us at First Baptist Church. We hope you can join us again, online or in person, in Sweetwater, Texas, as we learn to live out God's calling in the world around us.